All right, so we are in Daniel chapter 7, and just to kind of review here, we are looking at the area around the Mediterranean. Remember in Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, it says that Daniel sees this vision of the Great Sea, which would have been the Mediterranean Sea. And then he sees these four beasts come up out of the Great Sea. We have the first is this lion with wings. We talked about how this represents the kingdom of Babylon. The man's heart is given to it, just as Nebuchadnezzar lived like a beast, and then God returned his mind and his sanity to him when he humbled himself. The second animal in Daniel 7 is this bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, raised up on one side or leaning over on one side. We talked about how this is the alliance, the lopsided alliance of the Medes and the Persians who conquered the Babylonians. Then the third beast in Daniel 7 is this leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. We talked about this representing Alexander the Great's Greco-Macedonian Empire, the speed with which he conquered the world. And you can't even see it on this map, but he stretches much further east to the region of India. He does this very quickly while he's still a young man, but then he dies suddenly, and his kingdom is divided into 4 parts by his major generals. And of course, this beast in Daniel 7, this leopard, has 4 heads, representing the division of Alexander's empire. And finally, the 4th beast is this. Well, Daniel doesn't even know what to call it. This terrible beast, he says, that's got iron teeth and bronze nails and devours and conquers. He's got 10 horns. And we talked about it representing the kingdom of Rome that crushed and conquered other kingdoms. It ruled for well over 500 years, and it did so with an iron hand. And conquered really the whole area around the Mediterranean. But
it's quite a large area, isn't it?
Yeah, huge. And really it was the heart of, it's the heart of Western civilization at that time. So, but in Daniel, we not only have 4 beasts in Daniel 7, but we then have this little horn power. And in fact, much of the chapter is focused on this little horn, and that's what we're going to spend time not only this week, but also in some upcoming studies as well. And this little horn power doesn't just conquer, but it actually fights against God and his people. And that is why it's so significant, because it has a spiritual component to it. And then we see the Son of Man, who is given a kingdom, who judges the beasts of Daniel 7, and the little horn takes the kingdom away, the dominion away from the little horn. He establishes an eternal kingdom, and then he allows the saints of God, the people of God, to possess the kingdom. So all of these are, this is kind of the build-up, the flow of the chapter in Daniel 7, ultimately culminating in God's kingdom and his people reigning with him forever. So we talked last time about this little horn and 8 identifying characteristics. So we're just going to put those up here on the screen now. The 8 identifying characteristics of the little horn that we saw last time from Daniel 7, verse 8, verses 20 and 24, as well as 25. It's going to come up from among the 10 horns, or the 10 kings. It's going to subdue 3 horns. It's going to be different from the rest of the 10 horns, and it's going to be greater than his fellows. These first 4 are talking about how the little horn relates to the other horns, the other kingdoms of the Roman Empire. The last 4 are how it relates to God and his people. So he's going to speak pompous words, number 5, against the Most High. He's going to make war against the saints. He's going to think to change times and laws. He's not actually going to be able to do it, but that's his intention, that's his thought, his plan. And number 8, the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. And we saved this one for last because it's the most complex. And remember, we talked about this. What does this mean? Time, times, and half a time. It's kind of a cryptic way to word something there. And we talked about how that word times, time or times in the Aramaic, literally means year. And so if we kind of walk through what this means, we have a time represents a year. And we talked about how we're counting these years as 360 days. That's the astronomical calendar, celestial calendar that the Babylonians used, even the Jews at certain times. And it's very much an idealized calendar. We'll talk about why that was in a little bit. So times would be 2 years. So not only 360 days, but now it's double that, 720 days. And half a time, of course, is half a year, or 180 days. So all in total, time, times, and half a time, we're counting it as 1,260 days. This number is very important, and we know that we're on the right track because we see this same time period mentioned not only in the book of Daniel, but also in the book of Revelation. So we see time, times, and half a time in Daniel 7:25 and 12:7, but also in Revelation 12:14. We see the time period of 42 months, which would be 3.5 years. 3 times 12 plus a half a year, another 6 is 42. We see that in Revelation 11, verse 2, and 13, verse 5. And then Revelation 11:3 and 12:6 also describe this time period as 1,260 days. And last time we looked at Revelation 12:6 and also 12:14, and we saw that the 1,260 days are equated in Revelation to the times, and half a time. So Revelation is adding up 3.5 years as 1,260 days. So we know that they're using this idealized 360-day calendar, not the 365-day calendar that you and I know from our more modern times. So that means this little horn power rules for 1,260 days. So that was our 8th identifying mark, and what we're going to do this evening is we are going to see if we can identify from history what, I'm going to back up. We're going to see if we can identify from history whether or not Antiochus Epiphanes fits these 8 characteristics. And the reason that we're doing this is Antiochus Epiphanes is by far the most common interpretation of the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. We talked about how there's 3 schools of thought: preterism, meaning the prophecies are pointing toward the past; futurism, which is the prophecies are pointing toward the future; and historicism, which is kind of a bridge in between, meaning the prophecies start in the time of the prophet and extend toward the time of the end in the future. That's that middle camp is where I lie, and we'll explain that a little bit more. But we're going to look at the preterist camp today and this Antiochus Epiphanes figure and see how he lines up with the predictions in Daniel chapter 7 and 8. And let me just, for those of you who don't know very much about Antiochus Epiphanes, we're going to get to know him a little bit here tonight. He wasn't a very pleasant figure. He was a king of the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucids were one of the 4 parts of the Greek Empire that broke up. Remember the 4 heads on the leopard, Alexander the Great, when he died, he didn't have a son to take the throne. His wife was pregnant at the time, but he didn't have a son to take the throne. And on his deathbed, they said, "Alexander, who gets the kingdom?" And he said, "The kingdom goes to the strongest." Well, that didn't lead to peace. That led to conflict, and eventually there were 4 main generals who each carved out a piece of the kingdom. And those 4, as the years went on and their successors fought, it really whittled down to 2. The Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. And Antiochus is a king. Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth is a king of the Seleucid Empire. So this is, think of
sense.
northern Palestine. You can think of the Syria area, just to the north of Israel. And those two kings, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, fought back and forth, and at different times, those kingdoms controlled the area of Israel or Palestine. So at the time of Antiochus, his kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, controlled the area of the Jews, of Palestine. And he instituted a campaign of oppression against the Jews. We're going to read about that a little bit in First Maccabees. And this campaign of oppression, and ultimately what he did in the sanctuary itself, the temple itself, is why many people interpret the little horn as pointing toward him. Before we jump a little further, maybe I should take some time for questions or comments. We've kind of covered a lot, and I haven't really even stopped to catch my breath. So questions, comments, thoughts so far, just about what we've talked about and the very brief introduction to Antiochus Epiphanes.
Israel, it wasn't just about the Jews, was it? I mean, the land where they were, it was a good trade route from the north and the south and the east. So that it was a valuable piece of land.
It was very valuable. So if you think about the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia, they are bridged by land through Israel. And in fact, at the time of the Bible, there were two major roads that went through there, the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea, that were major trade routes that really connected these two continents. So Antiochus is not so much concerned about this area because of the Jews, but because of its value for trade, but then also as kind of a buffer between other kingdoms that may invade.
Strategic.
Yeah, strategic.
He's strategic.
Exactly. So questions, thoughts, comments so far?
Oh, they're really smart.
Everybody's up to date. Okay, we're good to go. So what we're going to do then is we are going to go over and we're going to read a passage from the book of First Maccabees. I don't know if anybody has read Maccabees before, but Maccabees was Bev's raising his hand, good. Got some historians here, some Bible students. So Maccabees was a book that was originally written in Hebrew around the 2nd century BC. Bev's got it in his Bible. You've got the Apocrypha there. Okay, good. It was written originally in Hebrew. We don't have the Hebrew translation. What we have is a translation from the Septuagint in Greek. And it is included in Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles because Catholics and Orthodox consider it canonical. Protestants and Jews don't consider it canonical. Some of them refer to it as apocryphal, that sort of thing. But it is a historical account of this time period of Antiochus. Some of the events before, but mostly the events after Antiochus, during Antiochus and after. And I'll just say that the name Maccabee, there's a character, we'll read a little bit about him tonight. This is from family, Judas Maccabee and his family, and it means the hammer. There's a lot of battles, and there's some thought that maybe he used a hammer in battle. That was his weapon of choice. Or maybe it's just that he, was a kind of a symbolic hammer defeating his enemies. So we're going to read 1 Maccabees chapter 1. We're going to read verse 41 all the way down to 48. And you can follow along. And I'll mention one other thing here. If you don't have a Bible with an Apocrypha in it, or you don't have an access to this, you can go to BibleGateway.com.
Oh, yeah, I've used that site.
BibleGateway.com. It's a great site to read the Bible in any translation. And they have, you know, all the apocryphal books and different translations. This translation here is the New Revised Standard Version, but you could read Maccabees or any book of the Bible there on that site, BibleGateway.com. So I'm going to ask Renee if she'll read for us here 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 41 through 48.
Then the king wrote to the whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king, and many, even from Israel, gladly adapted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane.
Okay, so let's just talk just a little bit before we keep reading here. So this king is Antiochus Epiphanes.
Okay.
He is exercising his authority here in Judea. At that time, Hellenism was a very big deal. So remember Alexander the Great, when he not only conquered these people, he didn't just conquer them, but he brought Greek culture.
Okay.
And that process is known as Hellenization. In fact, if you look at a lot of the culture of the Roman Empire, which came after Greek, it was still a lot of Greek culture, Greek customs, Greek gods, this sort of thing. So Alexander the Great promoted Greek culture. This is why at the time of Jesus, Greek was the lingua franca because of this process of Hellenization. And this was a big deal for the Jews because Greek culture in some ways went against their beliefs. For instance, the worship of Greek gods. One of the things that was a big deal was when the men would go to a gymnasium, which it's not quite like we think of a gym now, but there would be bathhouses and things, and the Jews, of course, would be circumcised. The Greeks would be not, and they would be made fun of and ridiculed, even persecuted because they were circumcised. And so there's these conflicts between Greek culture and Jewish culture. Obviously, Antiochus Epiphanes is part of the Hellenistic kingdom of the Seleucids, so he's going to side with the Greeks. And to him, anything pushing back against his kingdom is kind of seen as a political threat. And so he says everyone should be one people. We need to have just one custom, one way, one culture. So he's trying to put down the Jewish customs and ways of thinking. And we can see that here. So he... some of the Jews already, without Antiochus's, they profane the Sabbaths and sacrifice to idols. But now he's going to forbid Jews from keeping the Sabbath. He's going to forbid them to offer burnt offerings and sacrifices to Yahweh in the sanctuary, from keeping the festivals. He's going to want them to eat unclean animals and sacrifice pigs and all of these things. And so this is a big deal. This is a very much a big deal.
I can see why it would be a big deal to the Jews.
Yeah. Okay.
The unclean animals in particular would make a major statement to them.
For sure, for sure. So let's keep reading here. We'll go verse 48 down through 54. And Renee, if you'll read those for us.
So starting back at 48, it says they were made to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrifice on the altar of burnt offering. Now, is that the altar of burnt offering as
in the temple? Yes.
The Jewish temple?
Yes.
Okay. Ooh. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets.
Okay, thank you. So we can see this is a major deal for the Jews. They're being persecuted. They're being made to change their laws, their festivals, their Sabbath. Those who are joining with this, things are fine, but those who don't, they're being threatened with death. They have to flee. They're even going into to places of refuge, the caves and the surrounding wilderness. And then on the 15th day of Kislev, in 145th year, so this is like 167 BC, Antiochus has a image of Zeus placed in the temple in Jerusalem. And then he proceeds to have pigs offered as sacrifice to Zeus there in the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now you can see this is a big deal. This is a huge deal to the Jews.
Yes, a clash of cultures, totally.
Absolutely clash of cultures and religion and values in many ways. And so you'll notice that let me go back here. So when it says that he erected a desolating sacrilege, that word desolating sacrilege, the different Bibles translate it as abomination that causes desolation. So for instance, you see down on the bottom of the screen, the NCB, that's the New Catholic Bible, translates this as the abomination that causes desolation.
Okay.
Well, that phrase is, abomination that causes desolation, is taken directly out of the book of Daniel. We'll see that in chapter 9, in Daniel chapter 11. The little horn in Daniel chapter 8 is called the transgression that causes desolation. So this idea of the abomination that causes desolation is found throughout the book of Daniel. And the reason that First Maccabees is using that language to talk about what Antiochus has done in the temple is because it's interpreting Antiochus's actions as a fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. So it's saying that what Antiochus has done is that abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of. So it's interpreting the actions of Antiochus as a fulfillment of what happened in Daniel. Okay, so let's keep reading here, and let's go all the way through verse 61 of 1 Maccabees chapter 1 here.
Starting at verse 56?
Sure.
The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. And on the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. That's terrible.
It is horrific. It is very horrific, very violent, very brutal. So, with this description that we've just read in 1 Maccabees, obviously what Antiochus did was a big deal.
Yes.
For the Jews. This was a very devastating sort of thing. And we can see right off right from first glance that there are some similarities between what Antiochus does and what the little horn is said to do in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. So what we need to do is kind of start walking through this and see if there is indeed a full match between Antiochus and the little horn. So we're going to start. We're going to start going through these 8 identifying characteristics, and we're going to talk about whether or not Antiochus fits the bill. So remember, we've got these 8 things from Daniel, and just kind of like a mugshot, we're looking for something that lines up with all of them, and we'll see how Antiochus does. So the very first one that we noticed last time in Daniel 7, verse 8, and so forth, is that this little horn power comes up from among the 10 horns. Now, good Bible students, what beast are the 10 horns attached to, and what does that beast represent? Rome. I see Joe saying Rome. So these 10 horns, remember, are attached to that 4th beast with the iron teeth, the kingdom of Rome. So this little horn in Daniel 7 is to come up among the Roman, the divisions, or the breakup of the Roman Empire, these kings that come out of the Roman Empire.
And you said he was a king of a Grecian.
He was king of a Greek empire. So one of the fragments of the Greek empire, that split into 4, and then it got whittled down to 2. So Antiochus really, actually, he comes before.
Yes, it doesn't work for him there.
Yes, he comes before. In fact, you'll see that we date the beginning of Rome right about this same time. 168 BC is what we typically assign the date. That's because of the Battle of Pydna. That was one, which is the time that Antiochus is operating. So Antiochus couldn't have come from Rome, because Rome is it's like emerging the same time that he is operating.
He's too soon.
Yeah, he's too soon. He's too early. But before we dismiss this outright, I just want to explain a little bit how other Bible interpreters deal with this issue.
How do they buy into it then?
Yes, exactly. So you'll remember that last time we compared Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8. And we saw that in each of these chapters we have a very similar sequence. In Daniel 2, we have this image of gold, the head of gold, the arms of silver, the belly of bronze, the legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay, and then this stone kingdom. In Daniel 7, we have the lion, the bear, the leopard, the beast, the 10 horns, plus the little horn, and then God's kingdom that reigns forever. And then Daniel 8, we have kind of this narrowing of things that we're talking about, but it's zooming in. So you kind of imagine a camera zooming in on something. You're going to miss out on some of the details. They're going to kind of be pushed off the screen, but others are going to be more are going to be enlarged. So in Daniel 8, we have a ram and a goat, but then we also have a little horn, and then that little horn, his kingdom is broken. So we have understood, as we've been studying, we've understood the sequence of 4 kingdoms as being Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Mm-hmm. And then the dividing or the splitting up of Rome, and then ultimately the last kingdom as being the kingdom of Christ. Those who understand the little horn as being Antiochus don't follow the same sequence of 4 kingdoms. So they would say that the sequence of 4 kingdoms is not Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, but that the sequence of 4 kingdoms would be Babylon, Media, then Persia as a separate kingdom, and then Greece.
Okay.
So what they're doing, you see, is they're taking the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, and they're dividing it out into 2 separate kingdoms.
That pushes it down farther.
Yes, it pushes things down further, and so it would make the little horn at the time of the kingdom of Greece rather than the kingdom of Rome. A couple things here just to think about. So what this means then is that the ram and the goat of chapter 8, they don't line up with the bear and the leopard, but that they line up with the leopard and the fourth beast. So when we understood it, we talked about the bear representing Medes and the Persians. Remember, the bear is leaned up on one side, and it represents the Medes and the Persians. And we said this is very similar to how the ram is in Daniel 8, even though we haven't gotten there yet. There's two horns on the ram, one's bigger than the other. It's lopsided. And Daniel 8 verses 20 says that the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. It unites them together. So here, in this idea, they would be saying the bear represents the Medes, but the leopard represents the Persians, and the beast represents the Greeks. So the beast correlates to the goat, and the ram would correlate to the bears and the leopards. I don't think this works.
No.
I don't think this works. And
No.
let me just show you a couple of things. Why don't we jump over to Daniel chapter 8 together very quickly. Well, I know we haven't studied this as a whole, but jump with me to Daniel chapter 8, and I just want to explain to you why I don't think that this can work. Okay, so in Daniel 8, we have a vision where Daniel sees this ram. This ram is said to be great. He's got two horns, and the bigger one grows up later. So one horn grows up, and then the bigger one grows up later. And then this goat comes flying across the earth, beats up on it. This goat's got one big horn in its head. And notice with me Daniel 8, verses 20 and 21. The angel who interprets makes things very clear what the ram and the goat represent. So if you'd read that for us.
Verses 8?
Daniel 8, verses 20 and 21.
That was a little off. Okay.
You're fine.
All right. So, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece.
Oh, verse 20. I think
The ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. So that's quite explicit. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power.
Okay, so a couple things that we just need to understand here. Number one, notice how the angel, when he's interpreting the vision here in Daniel 8, talks about Media Persia. They're one kingdom, right?
Yes.
They're represented by one beast here in chapter 8. And so it doesn't really make sense to use two symbols in chapter 2, one for the Medes and one for the Persians, two symbols for in chapter 7, one for the Medes and one for the Persians, when in chapter 8, they're one.
It's not consistent.
Yeah, and in fact, every time you talk, you read about the Medes and the Persians in Daniel, almost every time it's talking about the Medes and the Persians together, like in Daniel 6, the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be altered. So it doesn't really make sense to split them up. And furthermore, we know that it wasn't the Medes who conquered the Babylonians. It was a coalition of the Medes and the Persians, with the Persians at the helm, who conquered the Babylonians. So it's not quite accurate to say you've got Babylon, Media, and then Persia. One other thing I'm going to mention, and then we can take some questions. Remember in Daniel 7, the bear is leaning to one side. Yes. That's a very clear correlation between the ram, which has the two horns, one higher than the other. And then how many heads on the leopard in Daniel 7?
4.
4. And notice in Daniel 8, Daniel 8 verse 21 and 22, the kingdom of Greece is broken into 4 pieces. The Persians were never broken into 4. It was the kingdom of Greece that was broken into 4. So I think it's very clear that the sequence of the 4 animals in Daniel 7 really should be Babylon, Media-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And to say that it's Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, and then Greece doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit with history, and it doesn't really fit with the text either. Okay, before I go on any further, any questions, comments, or thoughts just about understanding that Antiochus came too early to fit that first description of the little horn. He's coming just as the Roman Empire is coming into swing. He's not part of the fragments of the Roman Empire and rising up among them. Does that make sense, or any questions about that?
Charlotte has a question.
Charlotte's got a question. Charlotte, please, what's your question?
How widespread is this belief that Antiochus actually could have been the small horn?
Good question, Charlotte. So Charlotte's question is, how widespread is the belief that Antiochus was the little horn? So this is, if you are to read any scholarly work about the book of Daniel, almost always this is the accepted interpretation. In fact, most stuff that's written by scholars today is written by critical scholars, meaning they don't accept that Daniel is prophetic. They believe it was written as history after the fact. So they believe that the book of Daniel was written in 164 BC about Antiochus Epiphanes after Antiochus rose to power and then disappeared from the scene. So I would say this is by far the most common interpretation among critical scholars, and then even some conservative scholars for sure also would hold to this view. So good question. Any other questions about this first identifying characteristic of the little horn?
The major religious groups today believe in this? Believe in Antiochus? I mean, the Jews really put a lot of stock in the story of Antiochus.
Yeah, so the most Jewish interpreters would interpret it this way, and most Christian interpreters would interpret it this way.
Wow.
Yeah, that's accurate. Okay, so first identifying mark is that he's going to come up among the 10 horns. And we can say that no, that's not true, that Antiochus Epiphanes does not come up among the 10 horns of the Roman Empire. The next identifying mark is that he's going to subdue 3 horns, or 3 kingdoms. This is also not true. It's simply Antiochus, as a Seleucid king, does not overthrow 3 kingdoms. He has some military success, but really it's very limited. He tries a campaign down in Egypt, in the south, and in fact, when Rome hears about it, they don't like what he's doing, and so they send a senator, I think his name is Pompilius. He goes down there and he confronts Antiochus, and he takes his staff and he draws a circle around Antiochus in the dirt, and he says, you need to get out of here, and you're not allowed to step out of that circle until you tell me whether or not you're going to follow Rome's orders to leave and to withdraw. And so that doesn't give him a lot of time to think. So he withdraws at the command of Rome and heads back up, and doesn't really conquer Egypt. So there's not 3 kings or powers that are subdued by Antiochus. So the third identifying mark is that Antiochus would be different from the rest of the horns. And I think this is something that you could fairly say would fit with Antiochus. He was different than the other Seleucid kings in that he persecuted the Jews. Mm-hmm. He, sets up this sacrifice in the temple. None of the other Seleucid kings are doing this, so he stands out in that way. and if it weren't for him doing that, we wouldn't even talk about him today, because there were actually other Seleucid kings who were more powerful and more successful and that sort of thing. But because of his religious persecution, he stands out from the others. That one does fit. The fourth one says that he will be greater than his fellows. And Daniel 8 speaks about this as well. So in Daniel 8, it says that the ram became great. It says that the goat grew very great. And then it says that the little horn grew exceedingly great.
Oh.
So this is interesting. You've got a progression here, don't you?
Yeah.
You go from ram, which is great, and we know it tells us right there that the ram is the Medes and the Persians. The goat, which represents Greece, is very great, and so this little horn grows exceedingly great. So the Medes and the Persians are great, the Greeks are very great, and the little horn is exceedingly great. So notice the comparison. Can we say that compared to the Medes and the Persians and the empire of Greece, that Antiochus Epiphanes was exceedingly great?
Well,
we can't.
No.
Most people haven't even heard of him before, unless you're a student of the Bible. He wasn't exceedingly great compared to these great empires that ruled for hundreds of years, that conquered vast, swaths of the earth. He was a minor, relatively unknown king who happened to persecute the Jews. So he's not great in power or success. In fact, his father, Antiochus Epiphanes, was the fourth. Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. His father, Antiochus Epiphanes the third, was known as Antiochus the Great because he had a lot of military success. And so Antiochus Epiphanes, he's not known as the Great. In fact, the eponym that's given to him is Antiochus Epimanes, meaning Antiochus the Mad, the maniacal, the crazy one. So he wasn't known as great. He was known as kind of crazy and out of his mind. And that's partly because we don't know why he was so intent on persecuting the Jews. It seems like it was more than just political, but we don't understand his motivation. So
he was very wicked.
Yes.
So he definitely was influenced by the dark world.
Yeah, I think Satan definitely used him as a tool. So, was Antiochus greater than his fellows? No, you can't say that he was. He was a minor king in that stage of history. All right, so far we've seen some of these don't match. We've seen one that does match. Let's go down now to the kind of the spiritual ones, the last four. And these are the ones that are the primary reason that most people see Antiochus as being the fulfillment of the little horn. So number 5 is that he speaks pompous words against the Most High.
He did that.
And certainly his demeanor toward spiritual things was one of arrogance. Now, we don't know, we don't have any record of a time when Antiochus spoke words that we would say, okay, these are blasphemous words. He gave these orders, set up Zeus and, in the temple and, forbidding these things. But we don't have any direct quotes of something blasphemous. But we do know, so if you look at this coin here on the screen, this is a coin minted during his reign. He's there on the front side, and on the back it has his title, Antiochus Epiphanes. And you think about an epiphany. What's an epiphany? It's like a manifestation, and it's used, we kind of use it as like a bright idea, but really it has kind of more of a spiritual connotation. And what the title on the back literally means is Antiochus, the manifest of God. So kind of he's like a manifestation of God. Well, this wasn't an uncommon thing for kings, right?
For kings and emperors, yes.
They claimed divinity, and his name, he's Antiochus Epiphanes IV, so he's not even the first one to claim that title. He's the fourth one to claim that title. So it's blasphemous, right? They're claiming divinity, but he's not the only one to have done it. But certainly he does, he seems to have an arrogant and boastful demeanor toward God and toward spiritual things, at least to the God of the Hebrews.
By changing the laws and not allowing them to worship on Sabbath, that would have been definitely something against God.
Yeah, and in many ways he has an attitude of being above God. You know, he doesn't care about the God of the Jews. He doesn't care about Yahweh and his ways and his laws. He sees himself as above
That
him.
seems to be a common characteristic of the people before in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, so we can see this proud, this arrogant, same sort of attitude in Nebuchadnezzar and in, of course, his son. Okay, so yes, Antiochus does speak pompous words against God. Number 6 is that he makes war with the saints, and this is true. I mean,
Yes.
this is what he's known for. He persecutes God's people. He's killing, men and women and children, those who are circumcised, those who are keeping the law, those who are found with the law, those who are keeping the Sabbath, the Jewish festivals, those who are sacrificing Yahweh. He's persecuting them. He's killing them. We don't know how many, and ultimately the Jews form militias to start fighting back against him, and which is going to have a big effect upon their history. And then, unfortunately, they actually will go and start persecuting some of the Gentiles themselves, kind of as vengeance for the persecution that they faced. But yes, he does persecute God's people. Number 7 is that he would think to change times and laws. And he does do this. He certainly does this. We saw where in 1 Maccabees where he talked about the Jews were forbidden to keep the Sabbath and the Jewish festivals, and they were forbidden from worshiping God. And so all of these are an affront to God, his times and his laws. I think the Sabbath is interesting in particular because that is the law in the 10 Commandments that has to do with time. You've got
times and laws.
Yeah, so particularly, the Sabbath was a big deal, we know, to the Jews, and he, is causing them to profane it. So, yes, he does do this. He fits the bill for this. So far, we've got some misses and some hits for Antiochus. Certainly, he hasn't fulfilled all of the description, but he has fulfilled some of them. The last one is that he would, the saints would be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half a time. This is this time period, this 1,260 days that we talked about. And did Antiochus persecute the saints for this long? Did he desecrate the temple for this long? And we know from the book of Maccabees exactly how long Antiochus did the things that he did. So in 1 Maccabees, you might remember, let me go back and refer to it here. It says in 1 Maccabees 1:54, on the 15th day of Kislev in the 145th year. So the month of Kislev in the 145th year, so that's about 167 BC. And then notice we are now in 1 Maccabees chapter 4. It tells us exactly how long Antiochus desecrates the temple. And does what he does. So if you'll read that for us, Renee, 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verses 52 through 58.
Early in the morning, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the laws direct on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At that very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days, and joyfully offering burnt offerings, they offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priest and fitted them with doors. There was very great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed.
Okay, so let's talk about this just a little bit here. It gives the date, the 25th day of Kislev, the 148th year, so this is 164 BC, and it tells us exactly when the Antiochus, they cleanse the temple, they reset up everything, they rededicate the temple. By the way, this is the story of Hanukkah. If anybody's familiar with the story of Hanukkah, this is when they rededicate the temple, and there's the story of the miracle of the oil burning. Even though they didn't have enough oil to burn, it continues to burn, and they dedicate the temple for 8 days. And this is known as the Festival of Lights, which, by the way, Jesus celebrated. In the Gospels, it tells us that Jesus celebrated this festival, which wasn't one prescribed in the Bible, but we're told that Jesus celebrates this rededication of the temple. So we have a time period here. And this time period, depending on how you interpret it, it's either 3 years, exactly 3 years to the day, or it's 3 years and 10 days. If you either count from when he first sets up the image in the temple, or from when he puts the sacrifice in the image, either the 15th of Kislev or the 25th of Kislev, and then the rededication starts on the 25th of Kislev. So it's either exactly 3 years, or it's 3 years and 10 days. So it's not quite a fit, is it?
Not quite.
Not quite a fit. And notice with me, just very quickly, if you go with me over to 2 Maccabees chapter 10. This is verses 1 through 6. And yeah, if you'll read that for us, Renee.
Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners, and they also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices. After a lapse of 2 years, they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. And when they had done this, they fell prostrate and implored the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to the blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place, that is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. Okay,
so 2 Maccabees is actually an alternate, not an alternate, maybe that's the wrong word, a retelling of some of the same things as 1 Maccabees. So this is kind of a, like we have in the Gospels, we have multiple accounts of the same thing. That's what we have in 2 Maccabees. And notice 2 Maccabees gives the time period as 2 years to the day. 1 Maccabees says 3 years to the day. 2 Maccabees says 2 years to the day. Either way, the time period doesn't fit. In Daniel 7, it's 3.5 years. Here, the time period is 3 years, maybe 3 years and 10 days. So they're a couple months short, no matter how you slice it. Even when we count 1,260 days, which is not quite, if we're using the Babylonian calendar, it's not quite a full 3.5 years as we know it. It's still a couple months shy. Antiochus is a couple months shy. So, with that said, Antiochus does not fit this last description that the saints were given into his hand for a time, times and a half a time, 1,260 days. Now, you could say it's pretty close, right? I mean, it's 3 years compared to 3.5 years, maybe 3 years and 10 days. It's very close, but it's not quite. And in fact, because it's not quite, this is why most scholars date the book of Daniel to 164 BC. Because what they say is, Daniel got a lot of things right about Antiochus. He persecuted, he wore out the saints, his blasphemy, got a lot of things right about Antiochus, but got the date a little bit wrong. So the time period must not have been completed yet when the book of Daniel was written, because he made a guess, but he didn't get it right. And so most scholars recognize that the time period is off, and so they say, oh, that's because Daniel, he wrote his prophecy, or whoever wrote it, according to their thinking, wrote it just before Antiochus's time came to an end, and got the time period off. In fact, the Jewish translation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the book of Daniel, called the Septuagint, understands that Antiochus doesn't fit the time period, and so they actually change the days.
Oh.
That's in the old Greek version, not in a newer, the version of the Septuagint that was common in the time of the New Testament, the older Greek version. And in fact, Josephus, when he is interpreting the book of Daniel, Josephus was a Jewish historian who was ultimately sided with the Romans, and he wrote about the war between the Romans and the Jews. He wrote a lot about the Bible, and when he's talking about Daniel, he understands Antiochus as being the fulfillment of the little horn, but he realizes that the time periods are wrong, and so when he quotes Daniel, he changes the time in order to match Antiochus. I think God gets things right when he does them.
Yes, he's
and
precise.
Even though Antiochus is close, it's not quite a complete match. And he fits some of the characteristics, 3 or 4 of the characteristics, but he doesn't fit all of them. And so even though he fits some of them, even though what he did was, we're not trying to diminish what he did, he fits some of them, but he can't be the little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 because he doesn't fit all of the descriptions. It's got to be somebody else who fits all of the descriptions. Otherwise, we would have to say, if he is a fulfillment of the little horn, that God got it wrong, that he made some mistakes here and couldn't quite figure out the math or the timing or something. So, although Antiochus is close, he is not a fulfillment of the little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Okay, I've talked a lot here. We've kind of gone fast. Questions or comments so far?
Can you just put those 8 identifying characters up again?
Absolutely. Okay. So we've got the 8 identifying characteristics here, comes up from among the 10 horns, subdues 3 kings, subdues 3 horns, different from the other 10 horns, greater than his fellows, speaks pompous words against the Most High, makes war against the saints, thinks to change times and laws, and the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and a half a time.
Now, you didn't come up with those 8 characteristics. You gleaned them from chapter 7. Is that
Yeah,
right?
these are taken directly from Daniel 7, verse 8, verse 20, verse 24, and verse 25. In our last session, we just step by step went through those verses and made this list of 8 characteristics. And while Antiochus fits some, he doesn't fit all. So if you've got that mugshot from the police, and yes, they've got the same color hair and the same eye color, but they're a foot taller,
Yes.
something's off. It can't quite be the same person that we're looking for.
So this prophecy is very important.
Mm-hmm.
That's why God has set out certain characteristics so that we can know for certain who the identity is of this little horn.
Yeah, I think if it wasn't a big deal, maybe God wouldn't have mentioned it at all, or maybe just mentioned a few things. But there's a lot of time spent in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 on these things.
And John in Revelation, he picks up on it too.
That's a very good point. Yes, he does. And in fact, I want to just very quickly take you to two places in the New Testament where we know that people we can trust, authors of the New Testament, Jesus and John, they interpret this abomination of desolation, this little horn in Daniel, different than Antiochus. So go with me to Matthew 24.
So how many years is it from Daniel to Matthew?
From Daniel to Matthew is about 600 years, and
Okay.
then from Antiochus to Matthew is close to 200 years.
So this has to have a divine author.
Yeah. Okay, so Matthew 24. And we don't have time to really get into all the specifics of this chapter, but notice verses 15 and 16. If you'll read those for us, Renee.
Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains.
Okay, so Jesus is talking here. He's talking to his followers. If you read the context of Matthew 24, he's talking about the end of the world, the end of the destruction of the temple. He's pointing to a time forward from his day. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then you know you got to get out of there. Now, we saw in 1 Maccabees that 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54, very clearly understands Antiochus as being that abomination of desolation, that desolating sacrilege. Sacrilege is something that's an abomination, or, so First Maccabees interprets Antiochus as being that abomination or desolation from Daniel. But Jesus doesn't.
Jesus doesn't.
Because if he did, it would have been fulfilled in the past from his perspective. But he is pointing toward a future time when the abomination of desolation would stand in the holy place and people are to flee. So from Jesus' perspective, the fulfillment is future. Not in the past, it's in the future. Now go with me to Revelation. Revelation 13 and verse 5.
That's on page 1183.
And if you'll read that for us, Renee.
And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. And then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven.
And read verse 7 for us as well while you're at it.
It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation.
Okay.
So there's some common things there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You noticed it. So there's things there that are very common to the little horn. So we've got the time period that he is 42 months or 3.5 years. Notice he's got a mouth speaking great things. Where does that language come? Remember, the little horn's got eyes and a mouth, speaking both great words.
Like a human.
He blasphemes God, blasphemes the tabernacle, and he makes war against the saints. So there's like 4 or 5 connections between this beast here in Revelation 13 and this little horn of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. I think John is saying that they're the same power, they're the same entity, And from John's perspective, it wasn't fulfilled in the past, it's going to be fulfilled in the future. Remember Revelation 1:1. The angel gave the message to show John things that must shortly come to pass, or that must soon take place, things that are in the future from John's perspective. So John and Jesus both see this fulfillment as being in the future from their perspective.
And John adds here that every tribe, tongue, nation, all who dwell on the earth will worship him. That doesn't happen with Antiochus.
No.
The whole world.
Yeah. And this is why it's such a big deal, is because John is saying this is going to be a spiritual warfare that's not just localized, but it's going to be the world stage. And everyone's going to have to make a choice of whom they worship and who has their allegiance. We are coming up on the end of our time here, but I want to go back to something you said, Renee, earlier. Kind of, why does this matter? We've talked a lot about history and, looking these texts, and we're kind of getting down into some nitty-gritty things. And why spend all this time? Why does it matter? Okay, so it's not Antiochus. What difference does that make to me in my life? And I want to just very quickly make a connection with kind of a thematic connection between what's going on with this little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and with how that connects to the person of Jesus. And let me just explain what I mean. So the little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and even this beast power in Revelation 13, are sometimes they're referred to as an antichrist power. And that is because the word anti doesn't necessarily just mean against, but it can also mean a substitute, something in the place of. So in Revelation, you have this war between a lamb and a beast, right? The lamb represents Christ. This beast, this dragon, is this other power. But I want you just to notice how some of the characteristics of this little horn in Daniel 7 and 8 corresponds to Jesus, how it's in opposition to Jesus. So, for instance, the little horn speaks blasphemy, speaks these pompous words. It's proud, it's arrogant, it's self-exalting. Well, how does that compare to Jesus?
That's not Jesus.
It's the opposite, right?
Yes.
I mean, Jesus is the epitome, the truest form of humility. We looked in a previous lesson in Philippians 2, let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but humbled himself and became a man, obedient to death, even the death of the cross. He is not self-exalting. He humbles himself. He's like water. You think about water; it doesn't stop moving until it gets to the lowest place. That's the way Jesus was. He didn't stop humbling himself until he got to the cross, even the death of the cross. So his attitude is complete opposite of this little horn that is proud and blasphemous and self-exalting. Then you think about this little horn makes war against the saints. Well, Jesus doesn't make war. He's the Prince of Peace, right? And in fact, when he comes, he is actually killed by God's people. The religious leaders of God's people fight against him and kill him, and he allows them to do that so that he can deliver them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. So he doesn't make war against the saints. He comes to bring peace. And in fact, he dies in order to bring peace and to deliver God's people. Think about this little horn. It says he thinks to change times and law. Well, did Jesus come to change the times and the law? In Matthew 6:17, Jesus says, "Don't think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy them. I came to fulfill them." So the little horn is moving against God's law, trying to change it. And Jesus is saying, "No, I didn't come to change it. I'm here to fulfill it. I'm here to establish it." So there's this the little horn is going in the opposite direction of Jesus. And then finally, it says that the saints are given into his hand, the hand of the little horn, for a time, times, and half a time. Well, that's 3.5 years, as we've talked about. How long was the ministry of Jesus when he was here on earth? From his baptism till his resurrection and ascension. How long was he ministering? 3.5 years. We can count the festivals in John. So everything that the little horn is doing, he is pushing against who Christ is. He's pushing against the character, the heart, the ministry, the life of Jesus Christ. He's going in the exact opposite direction. And for that reason, he is very much an antichrist figure. He is against Christ, but he's also like this substitute for Christ. And, well, I'll just say it this way. Jesus is our salvation. In 1 John, it says, he who has the Son has life. And anything that is pushing against Jesus or coming in the place of Jesus, well, you're on dangerous ground there, right?
Yes.
You're on very dangerous ground. And we'll see that that's the view of Revelation, that this beast power is very much in opposition to and trying to be a substitute to as well Jesus and his ministry. In fact, we'll see that the beast in Revelation receives a deadly wound and then is resurrected just as right. Jesus was. So it's Satan moving in the place of and against Jesus Christ. And that's why all this is important. That's why it's not only important to understand Daniel 7, but also to be able to take what we understand from Daniel 7 and use that in the rest of Daniel and even in the rest of the book of Revelation. So I know we're spending a lot of time with this, but I think ultimately it does matter, and it will be helpful for us as we continue to study prophecy, because Jesus is at the center of prophecy. Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. He's at the heart of the book of Daniel, and prophecy needs to lead us toward him.
Yes.
And that's ultimately the direction that we are headed in. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our time today there. I do want to just very quickly put on the reading assignment for next week. Read Daniel chapter 7 again.
Okay.
I hope you've gone through it, and I hope you're very familiar with it. Then I would like for you to read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. This is going to be an important chapter for understanding. This chapter talks about this man of sin, this falling away, this lawless one. We're going to see some connections between this chapter and the little horn. And then later tonight, it's not up yet, but it will be later tonight, there will be a handout on the little horn and history. There'll be some historical references and quotes there. So take some time to read through that, and it will be helpful as we identify next time who this little horn power is from history, and talk about how it's made an impact not only upon history, but why it matters for us today. So we're going to have a word of prayer here as we close. I'm going to ask Renee if you would pray for us.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson. It's really it's important to understand who the enemy is, what they look like, to be able to identify them in the lineup, as Reed said, to be sure, because we want to be not a part of the enemy's side, not to follow them. And the Jews did at times follow the enemy's ways and cultures and laws. But God, we pray that you will be with us as we continue to study, that you will make these words real to us, and that you will that you will help us to see ourselves as we are, We see the common characteristics of the enemies of God are full of pride and arrogance, and they can do it. I did it my way, as that song that was popular when I was a young person. Lord, change our hearts, make us open to your voice, and bless those who have listened tonight, that the words will be meaningful to them, and bring us back again next week, I pray, in thy precious name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless each one of you. We will look forward to seeing you next week.
Until then.